How do I know if I have PTSD?
Mhm. Yeah, good question. So post-traumatic stress syndrome or disorder is what PTSD is. And it is a label descriptor for a cluster of symptoms that we experience in response to big T trauma as a part of our life. So I say big T trauma as opposed to little t trauma, which are terms that we use in the counseling field to describe different kinds of traumatic experiences that we have. And to back it up one step further, just talk about what a traumatic experience is. Essentially, a traumatic experience is anything that we experience in life that's overwhelming to us and that our system, our body, doesn't know how to process or handle. And so it processes that in the way that it does traumatic experiences, which can be a variety of different ways that can show up, but it's all related to how the body processes the experience. It can be cases where the different parts of the experience are splintered off from each other in order to containerize them, in order to kind of prevent them from being overwhelming to us. We develop defenses to avoid what we don't know what to do with. We can develop a fight or flight kind of hypervigilance that we get stuck in and trying to avoid the things that are the perceived threat that our brain doesn't know how to process or work through. And so while it's maybe an unclear answer about trauma to say, or a circular answer to say that trauma is anything that the brain processes as trauma. And so there are kinds of events that we can point to and say these things commonly cause trauma, but even things that commonly cause trauma aren't experienced traumatically by everybody. And so you and I, Tori, can have the same experience in life, and I might experience it traumatically, and you might not experience it traumatically. It has to do with how our brain processes it and the resources that we have in our life and our experience to be able to process the event. And so the pointing to the event itself isn't a great way to determine whether or not I've experienced trauma, but instead recognizing the symptomology that comes from experiencing trauma. So all that being said, little t trauma would be kinds of traumatic experiences that we don't commonly think of because they're not necessarily acute in nature. They tend to be more chronic in nature and things that happen over time. So for example, a kind of trauma that we experience and process often in therapy is an abandonment type trauma that happens from a parent or parents that are emotionally unavailable, right? So whether that's children of alcoholics, for example, can have parents who, because of their own experiences and their own addiction, are physically present in the home, but emotionally are not present to actually be able to connect, care for, and nurture their children. And so there's this wound that's the result of the cumulative experience of living with a parent who's not emotionally available to be there and connect, that leaves something lacking in the child's life that has the body processes traumatically, because as a kid, you don't know what to do with your parent not being there in times that you need your parent to be there. And that you don't have the brain capacity to parent yourself. And so you need something from your parents and you don't receive that from your parents. The brain of a child doesn't know what to do with that or how to navigate that. And so it compartmentalizes it in a way to survive what it doesn't know how to get through otherwise. So it's a real adaptive feature that got wired into our brain. So that's little t trauma kind of stuff, right?
Yeah. So would you say that can you classify little T trauma and big T trauma as something where you could experience PTSD with both of those things, or is it
Sure.
more big T trauma?
Yeah, so PTSD is more frequently related to or identified with big T trauma. So big T trauma is kind of what we think of as traumatic experiences, right? When I have a near-death experience, a car accident, or a house fire, or threat of violence in a robbery type setting, or anything that we experience as or perceive as life-threatening in some way, natural disaster type scenarios, or physical threat of harm or violence from another, or animal attack, war trauma, anything that's life-threatening in nature, that's overwhelming to the body and system, and therefore the body didn't know how to process that, and it becomes processed in a traumatic way or unprocessed in a way that causes it to be traumatic. So the symptomology of the hypervigilance, the flashbacks, the kind of physiological hyperarousal, the neurosystem hyperarousal, kind of being stuck in that fight or flight mode, or triggered into that fight or flight mode by things that remind the brain of that trauma, are what we tend to identify as being with PTSD. Now, brain scans and neuroimaging tell us that people can have PTSD type symptoms from little T trauma as well, that maybe don't necessarily look the same as PTSD symptoms with big T trauma, but we're realizing more and more that the little T trauma affects the neurosystem in a very similar way as big T trauma.
Gotcha. Yeah. That's great. That's a really good answer. I think that, PTSD is very common to
Mhm.
have, but I feel like a lot of people just sort of write off what they're experiencing, or just sort of
Mhm.
like invalidate, like, oh, whatever, like this isn't PTSD, like it's fine. I feel like a lot of people write it off, and then because of that, don't really process it. And
Mhm.
I've experienced that in my own life.
Yeah, and sometimes we don't even recognize the symptoms, right? Because they're not necessarily blaring in our face. Like, we can see the war vet who hears a bus backfire, and in his mind and his nervous system is back in Afghanistan or Vietnam, and he's instinctively curled up under a mailbox, taking cover to save his life in that setting, and go, that's extreme, and we can recognize the kind of that as being a PTSD type response. But what we don't recognize sometimes is just the hypervigilance of the nervous system that can show up as, like, say, irritability, right? That because of the adrenaline and cortisol, that are adrenal gland responses that are part of a system, nervous system being escalated in a hypervigilant state, can show up as anxiety. It can show up as restlessness, uh, difficulty sleeping, irritableness. Um, and so those symptoms don't necessarily register to a person as a trauma response, but they're the evidence of a nervous system that's kind of stuck on high alert, or is repeatedly and frequently triggered into a state of high alert.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you so much for that clarification, Josh, and just, answering that question with so much grace. It's a hard question, and everyone is so different, and everyone's experience is so different, and our responses. But
Yeah,
thank
I appreciate the word grace in that sentence. And I just want to encourage, folks to, yeah, be graceful with the people around you. I know maybe that sounds cliche, but from a vantage point of a professional counselor, I know that people are, dealing with stuff that you have no idea, and a part of their life, that they're not wearing on their sleeve their trauma or their experience. And so sometimes you engage people and you don't understand why they're handling a situation the way that they are. And we can assume all sorts of motives and reasons and explanations for why they're showing up the way that they are. But in reality, you have no idea what's part of their story and what they may be going through and what they may not even understand about why they're experiencing things the way that they are. And so seeing that from my seat as a professional counselor just really motivates me to engage life gracefully and to extend grace to those who respond in ways that are maybe annoying, frustrating, or just confusing to me, and to recognize I don't know what's going on in their world. The Lord knows. The Lord knows what's happening with them, and He's able to lead them in a journey to draw them to Himself and bring healing in their life. And what they need from me is to be able to have grace with them and to reflect the Father's grace in doing so.
Yeah, especially as believers, I think that this this idea of grace and kindness should just be so heightened to us. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Knowing that I don't know what's happened in your story. I don't know what you've been through or what you're going through. So I'm going to choose to be kind and I'm going to choose to be gracious. And I think just especially as believers, we're called to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's how we reveal our Creator, right? That we're created in His image, and we're designed to reflect His image in the way we engage. And so, being graceful as He's graceful, being merciful as He is merciful, and allowing the character and nature of God to be on display in the way that we relate to one another is really what it's about.